As you know, the state government has dropped details of a boost to buy housing scheme where if with a minimal deposit, the state government will toss in some money and they'll help you buy a home here in Queensland. So let's find out what an economist thinks of this. Leith Van Onselen is from macrobusiness.com.au. I spoke to Leith this morning when I read the story on the Courier Mail. Leith Van Onselen, unlike those with real estate interests, says he's not terribly impressed because guess what's going to happen?
It appears completely unnecessary, Steve. So just to give some perspective quickly, Brisbane dwelling values have increased by about 85% since the pandemic. So we're talking about since March 2020. But as a result, Brisbane now has one of the most expensive housing markets in Australia. It's actually overtaken Melbourne. And this sort of policy is going to do is going to add further demand to the market, and it's going to push up Brisbane home values. So this will come on top of, obviously, we've had 2 interest rate cuts. Financial markets are predicting another 3 rate cuts this year, which is going to obviously put a rocket under house prices. And then at the same time, the federal government has their 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers coming in on January 1 next year, which is going to put more demand into housing. And then the federal government also has their own shared equity scheme, which sounds kind of similar, but it doesn't. The federal government's version isn't quite as generous because it has tighter income caps, and it's also restricted to 40,000 households nationally. So it sounds like the Queensland government wants to basically get around those federal government caps by offering additional places to Queenslanders, as well as offering more generous, price caps and more generous income limits.
Why will it force up the price of housing? They're just trying to get people into housing.
That's right. So obviously, every time you increase demand for housing without increasing the supply, you're just going to drive up the price. So one of the reasons why Brisbane home values have risen so much since the pandemic is obviously we've had a massive rise in immigration. So also, people like me from Melbourne have gone up north to Brisbane where it was cheaper, and people from Sydney, they sell their expensive Sydney homes and they pile into Brisbane, and that pushes up prices. Also, migration, but this will just increase the capacity for people to pay for housing. It will bring people in the market who previously couldn't afford to enter the market, which I guess is a good thing on one hand. But the problem is these people will be bidding for the same stock of housing, which will just push up the price of housing. And what you'll end up with in the end is just higher home prices and a market that's structurally more unaffordable than it was before you started.
David Crisafulli, Queensland's Premier, this is their first budget, says in today's paper in the drop for this story ahead of the budget this afternoon, says Queenslanders shouldn't be locked out of buying because they don't have the bank of mum and dad. So we're making big changes to deliver a nation-leading boost to buy scheme to reduce the deposit gap. End of quote. What's the deposit gap, Leith Van Onselen?
Yeah. So what the deposit gap is Brisbane's median house price is over 800,000 now. So buyers typically need a 20% deposit to purchase a home. If you're purchasing your first home, if you want to avoid lender's mortgage insurance, which is very expensive, it can cost over $20,000, and that obviously requires a very large upfront deposit, and it takes years for people to save that. So if you can reduce that deposit gap through, for example, the federal government's 5% deposit scheme means you only need a 5% deposit rather than 20%, and you still don't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance. Or something like a shared equity scheme, you can get people into housing quicker. But the problem with it is, as I just said, you'll be having people purchasing homes with smaller deposits, so they'll be taking out larger debts in the case of the federal government scheme, their 5% deposit scheme. In the case of this, they'll have less equity in their home. And ultimately, you just have more buyers chasing the same housing stock, and it'll just end up pushing up home prices. And we've seen this for 20 years, Steve, or 25 years, first home buyer grants, etc. They're all similar. They're all measures that ultimately just lead to higher home prices. And in the end, you don't end up with a more affordable housing market because prices just keep rising. They become further out of reach. You have these sort of Band-Aid type measures like this, which bridge the gap for a short time, but then they end up pushing prices higher. So ultimately, you just end up with a structurally more unaffordable housing market, which isn't really the solution.
Is the Olympic build creating even more hyperinflation of housing here in Brisbane?
Yes, it certainly would be. So every time there's been Olympics in capital cities, in Sydney, etc., it generally leads to a house price boom beforehand. And part of that's because you have more economic activity, more growth, more people in jobs, etc., working in those sort of construction roles. Part of it's also once the Olympics is held, a place like Brisbane will become a international city, I guess, and it'll be in the sights of international buyers because they would have seen it on TV. They go, gee, that place is nice. They'll see the Gold Coast beaches, that kind of thing. So I think the Brisbane Olympics will be very stimulatory for the housing market. It'll bring in overseas demand, interest into Brisbane and the Gold Coast, etc., but also increase economic activity, jobs, incomes, that sort of thing in the short term during the construction build, which will just ultimately get capitalised to some extent into house prices.
I'll leave it there. Leith Van Onselen, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Steve.
Leith Van Onselen on the Boost to Buy scheme that's been dropped out of the state budget this afternoon at 2 o'clock. You can watch it online, by the way. Parliament.qld.gov.au is a web address. They broadcast it live. So if you're interested, you can watch it yourself.